and welcome back to the Cover 3 podcast here on CBS Sports. That's Danny Kanell, that's Bud Elliott, that's Tom Fornelli. I'm Chip Patterson, coming to you live on CBS Sports Network. Fired up to get you set over the course of the next hour for the first round of the college football playoff, the first time ever that we've had a 12-team bracket, the first time ever that those first-round games, they're going to be on campus. We got weather. We got all kinds of matchups that we are going to get into. But we want to begin with not a team that's going to be playing in the first round. We're going to begin with one of those teams that's awaiting the winner of a first-round result, because in the Sugar Bowl on January 1st, the SEC champion Georgia Bulldogs will play the winner of Penn State and SMU, the game on Saturday. The Georgia Bulldogs, we now know, have been preparing as though they are not going to have Carson Beck, not just in that game, but for the college football playoffs as a whole. Carson Beck, of course, injured that throwing arm elbow in the SEC championship game win against Texas, and now the Bulldogs will be moving forward with Gunnar Stockton. So, Danny, as we look at this and how it impacts your expectations for Georgia, we assumed that we were probably going to be dealing with Carson Beck, maybe not in game one, but now thinking that he's not going to be a part of the postseason at all, how does that change the ceiling for what Georgia can do in this college football playoff?
It probably doesn't change it very much. It hasn't for the odds makers, but it does for me. I'm actually kind of blown away at how people have just kind of disregarded, their starting quarterback is out. It's next man up. It's Georgia. They'll be fine. And I don't know if it's because of Stetson Bennett, former walk-on, led him to back-to-back national championships. I don't know if it's because Carson Beck hasn't been great at times and he's had those games where he's had 3 interceptions. But I'm still a little bit surprised that people are so lackadaisical. They're just like, man, no big deal. They're fine. I actually would change my bracket. I had them going to the finals. I would now have them losing in the semis, which, again, it's still pretty good and pretty nice to be able to go that far with the backup quarterback. But I do think at some point you're going to need Gunnar Stockton to step up and make the throws, and we haven't seen it yet. And a very, very limited body of work, I would expect him to struggle at times, which in these types of games, when they're going to be tight and the talent level is evened out, I think does cap their ceiling. Again, this is a program that has won multiple ways. He's surrounded by great talent, but there also was a 3rd and 13 interception, which did, send that game into overtime for them. So you're still going to see a very inexperienced quarterback. So for me, it does change the ceiling, and I'm actually surprised for the odds makers. It doesn't seem like it has that much.
I don't have to change my bracket because, I was the one who broke this news weeks ago, 20 minutes after the SEC championship game ended. I told you Carson Beck was done for the rest of the season. Having seen the injury live, I knew what was coming. It looks like a torn UCL to me. It looks like Tommy John. So this is no shock. That's why in my bracket, I didn't have Georgia winning their first game. I have them losing their first playoff game and having their season end because this is a huge blow. This is a Georgia team that all season long has not been consistent. Its defense is still good, but only a few times has it shown up and looked elite. And offensively, they've been up and down all year, Carson Beck included. Now, part of that coincided with the injury to their guard, Tate Ratledge, the best offensive lineman they have, struggling in pass protection without him, which led to Carson Beck being pressured and led to Carson Beck throwing a whole lot of interceptions. Since Ratledge returned, Beck's been better, but he still hasn't been the guy we saw last season. He's shown glimpses of it, but he was never really hitting that ceiling. So now Gunnar Stockton comes in, and I guess they have enough talent on that team to where maybe they can eke out a win, but I don't know how you look at this Georgia Bulldogs team in this 12-team field and feel like they can win 3 playoff games without Carson Beck. I just don't see it happen.
I think part of it is probably the path, right? I mean, if you look at this, Georgia's going to play the winner of Indiana-Notre Dame. And athletically, right, Georgia still has a lot better players than most of the guys who play for Indiana-Notre Dame. So, obviously, the kid threw for 70 yards, and they beat Texas. Is it possible that they could duplicate that and beat, the Irish or beat Indiana? And then round 2, if you run into a Penn State team that's humming, I agree. That's actually a real problem. But you don't think Georgia could beat a Boise or an SMU if SMU pulls an upset against Penn State in round 1, or if Boise upsets Penn State? Now, I think the problem is the team that comes out of the other side of this is probably pretty darn good. And then now they're going to have 2.5 full games of film on the back quarterback, because you get the second half of the SEC championship game where he almost threw it away. And if Texas can actually follow their blocks with that defensive back, it's probably a touchdown and ball game over, and Georgia may not even be in the playoff. But that's a lot of film to kind of figure out what this kid can and importantly cannot do. So I agree with that. I think he could win 2. 3 with him, I think, would be pretty darn hard.
Bud, number one, thank you for my correction there. Penn State SMU plays into Boise. This will be the winner of Friday night's game between Notre Dame and Indiana. And I agree with you on that. I still think Georgia can win 2 games because there's something about playing within yourself, playing within the system. And because Carson Beck, because of the talent and because of the tools, does have a higher ceiling than Gunnar Stockton, sometimes I think that some of those mistakes that were being made, we're pressing a little bit. We're trying to force something because Georgia is the worst first half offense in this college football playoff, and it is by a large margin. All of the other 11 teams in the college football playoff rank inside the top 20 in terms of first half scoring, and Georgia's not even the top half of the entire 134 FBS. They're about a touchdown behind in first half scoring. They are about 2 touchdowns behind Oregon, the best first half team. And so I think that Carson Beck, because of these slow starts, he was just always pressing. He was always just trying to do a little bit more. And because he's got the talent and the tools, he would go out there and think he could do it. Gunnar Stockton, I do think, is somebody who can play a little bit more inside himself, inside the system. He's got a little bit of scootability to him, some athleticism that also includes punting. He was a killer punter in high school, so if that becomes an issue for the Bulldogs, maybe we can pull something out there. But I think that they can win 1 game. Yes, I think they can even win 2, but the idea of winning 3 games and winning a national championship, I don't see it because, again, Carson Beck had a higher ceiling, and winning a national title, I do think, would require matching your ceiling as close as possible.
I also think now this is when the injuries and when depth become so important because Gunnar Stockton did get almost decapitated in that game.
Yes.
Did not finish. I mean, Carson Beck had to hand off one-handed, and thank goodness ETN was able to take it in the end zone. But now they're one more rung down. So if Gunnar Stockton, who does appear like he likes to run more and is not afraid, I mean, for everything I read about his teammates, they love him, the way his style of play. It looks like he puts his body on the line. What if something happens to him and then you're down to Jaden Rashad or further down, and then all of a sudden it becomes even more problematic? So it's definitely an issue for Georgia, and it'll be an interesting storyline to watch as they're trying to get, another national championship.
The other thing to look for here is that Georgia's dropback game has been really poor. They've had to scheme up a lot of this stuff. You recall at the end of the Georgia Tech game, like they're trying to throw the ball to guys who are really more gadget type players like an Arian Smith, guys who we know in big games, they purposely try to scheme up 1 or 2 touches for them. Meanwhile, like Aaron Smith's getting like 10 targets against Georgia Tech, partially because the game went to 8 overtimes, but also partially because they didn't have anybody else. And if they get Colby Young back, that's like the one guy who could be a real difference maker for Georgia because he's actually like a true X and not a guy you got to scheme it up for. He's a guy who can win one-on-one. He's a guy, really importantly here, who may be able to win in the red zone. So that's going to be something to look for. Like that might be able to help the backup here a little bit.
Yeah, it does get a little putt-putt from time to time with Georgia, just with like the little jet sweeps, the little screens, and just trying to give you a bunch of eye candy. Gunnar Stockton, he's got his work cut out for him, but a little bit of time to get prepared for the winner, again, of Notre Dame and Indiana. So from the SEC champions to the SEC runner-up, we have been monitoring the status of Texas wide receiver Isaiah Bond kind of throughout the season. It's been dealing with some injuries, from time to time. So, Bud, what is your expectation in terms of the adjustments here for the Longhorns? And for those who hadn't really been tracking the ins and outs, what Bond's impact is when he's in the game for Texas?
If the producers can just take and copy paste the analysis that I just had for Colby Young, use that for Isaiah Bond. He's a little bit smaller than Colby Young, but he is the one guy on Texas who can be a true contested catch guy, right? Like Bond does not need it scheme up for him quite as much. I think he is their best receiver when healthy by far. And I do think this matters a lot because Texas is so good at using motion, some of the swing stuff to get the guys the ball in space. And they will force Clemson to tackle. But it doesn't always work. And what happens on like 3rd and 7 when Quinn Ewers drops back and he needs to go like to somebody and Clemson's defense is like, yeah, we're not going to buy that eye candy today because it's 3rd and 8, right? Who cares? That's where I think they could miss Bond. But Clemson has to tackle first. If Clemson doesn't tackle these guys well in space, because Texas has a bunch of these little short dudes who can just move around and they're quick as hell once they catch the ball. If they don't tackle them, the Texas won't miss Bond at all.
Yeah, and I mean, it was a good thing they had Matthew Golden step up in such a big way in the SEC championship game. That's got to be a huge boost. They also have Wingo. They also have other weapons, but I do think it is a guy who was one of Quinn Ewer's favorite targets and a guy that could win in space. And you could go to, like, when you have man coverage, the guy you want to pick. It seemed like Isaiah Bond was that one. So one of Quinn Ewer's favorite targets, one of a big play in a machine. I absolutely think this is something that hurts him, but I don't think it's as devastating. First, it's not a quarterback like we were talking about. And two, the depth that Texas has with this roster that is one of the strongest in college football, I don't think it's that devastating. Yes, they'd be much better with him, but I don't think it's devastating without him.
It's interesting. If you look at Bond's season, like, he has been banged up. He's been dealing with injuries all year. But there's a strong correlation between his production and before Quinn Ewers was hurt and after Quinn Ewers was hurt. If you look at Texas's first few games of the season, that first month, Bond was putting up really good numbers. The numbers you expected when he transferred, the numbers that you were like, oh, that's why they went and got him. Since Ewers went out and then since he came back, he's typically having like 2 catch games for 22 yards, 1 catch for 15. He really has not been a huge part of the game plan, A, because of his health, but also B, I just don't think they trust Quinn's ability to get the ball to him in the spots where he excels. Bud, you mentioned he's an X receiver. He's a very good target down the field. We just really haven't seen Texas do a whole lot of stuff down the field since Quinn Ewers got hurt. So I think it matters because he's a very good player. And when you're in a college football playoff game, you want all the good players you can have on your team because it increases your chance to win. It's just, I don't know how big of an impact it will have in this first round game against Clemson. If they move on and they continue to miss out on Bond and he's unavailable, I think it'll be a bigger factor down the line.
We will continue to look at that matchup between Texas and Clemson a little bit later on in the hour. But coming up on the other side, oh, baby, we'll give you the football of it all between Ohio State and Tennessee, sure, but also the narratives, like what if, and answer that question and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Well, the game capping off Saturday night, our final first round game will be a showdown in Columbus as Tennessee arrives to take on the Ohio State Buckeyes. And it's interesting because these were two teams that earlier in the season were both in the mix to compete for their conference championships, but neither one made it to the conference championship game. Tennessee more on the outside looking in than Ohio State, which had the inside track till that loss to Michigan in their final regular season game. So a little bit of time off, a little bit of time to prepare. I want to get started with Ohio State's offensive line. And Tom, we identified that group as the injuries started to pile up as one place where Ohio State might find it difficult to be as good as they could be given all of the talent that is assembled there. They've had some time to get ready. Chip Kelly has told reporters about all the lessons that they've learned and ways they're going to change their offensive approach after the way that they played it against the Wolverines. How do you think we are going to see Ohio State's offense handle its business going up against a very stout defensive front?
Well, I don't think anybody in Columbus would dare say it. I do think it could be somewhat of a blessing in disguise that they lost that Michigan game and therefore didn't have to go to Indianapolis to play in the Big Ten championship, because it does allow them a chance to get healthier along the offensive line, even if you can't expect those guys to return. But also, it gives them more time for the guys that are now starting for them to kind of work together and gel and prepare for this game against Tennessee, which I think could be a benefit for them. It's something that they desperately need, because one of the primary reasons they struggled to beat Michigan was because they kept trying to run the ball, even though they couldn't run the ball because their offensive line was just getting pushed back by that Michigan defensive front most of the day. So I think you're hoping for improvement there, but I also think that you have to sit and look at the situation. Chip Kelly, during media availability this week, was saying he learned a lot of lessons from that game, and that makes me believe that we will see a little bit a change in approach offensively, like the idea of, oh, hey, that crazy freshman receiver we have who was dominating all season, Jeremiah Smith, what if we throw him the ball? Like, what if we try to get our best player the ball and see if he can make things happen? So I do expect that even in these weather conditions, it is going to be cold. It might be a little windy. we should see Ohio State drop back to pass a little bit more than they did in that Michigan game. And I think that they should because, frankly, that offensive line, even at full strength and at half strength, has been better in pass blocking than it has been in run blocking all season long. So when you're going up against this Tennessee defense, I would rather have my offensive line going backwards in this one than trying to push them forwards. So I think you're going to see the Buckeyes dropping back to pass a little bit more here.
I'm going to give you guys a hint here. If you need to get up and grab a beer, you need to go to the bathroom, watch first down. If the team fails, then go. Because I really think the winner of this ball game is going to be the team that finds a way to hit explosive plays on early downs. Ohio State had a real trouble blocking Michigan. I think Tom's totally right. They probably focused a little bit too much on the run game. Should have probably dropped back and passed a little more early on. But I also think that the Ohio State approach against Michigan was indicative of their level of concern with that offensive line. I mean, they were trying to secure so many doubles at the first level against some really good Michigan players, of course. But those linebackers, I mean, they were shooting gaps and causing big time problems all day. And that makes sense when you got a new center out there. You know, you've lost both tackles. Like it's a difficult situation for the Buckeyes. On the flip side, Tennessee's offensive tackles, when they don't have the benefit of play action, guys, they also don't block real well. And Ohio State's defensive ends have been maybe lacking consistency at times this year. But they can certainly get after the quarterback when it's time to pin their ears back. Just ask Penn State about that. So I think whichever team is able to take the chances on early downs when you have the real benefit of the run fakes and can hit those explosive plays off that, I think that team wins this ballgame. I think most of these teams are really in trouble if they get behind the chains.
I'd like to see Chip Kelly get in his bag. One of the better offensive minds we've known. I'd like to see Will Howard have one of his better games. The version that we saw on the road in Eugene. I'd like to see him clean it up a little bit. But in order to do so, I think they have to give him opportunities to run the ball, but also to take some shots. You guys mentioned it. Jeremiah Smith is one of the better, freshman sensations we've seen. They also have Emeka Egbuka. Like, this is a super roster, and I get the offensive line is challenged because some of the injuries, but there are ways to work around that. Get Will Howard outside the pocket. Work the screen game. Again, some of those screens can be to the wide receivers or to two of your superstar backs. You have got to keep this Tennessee front at bay. The way to do it is not trying to line up and smash it down their throat. Hopefully you learned by trying to do that against Michigan that was not the way to win. I think this has got to be one where you trust the offense to do their thing. I think the defense will be fine. I agree with you, Bud. You were just talking about the shots down the field. I think if you're Jim Knowles, the defensive coordinator, you've got to say, we are not letting Dylan Sampson beat us. Like, we cannot do that. Nico, good luck connecting on one of those outside shots. If he does, you tip your cap and then you make some adjustments. Until you see that, where Nico has struggled, has been on the road, you say, let's go. Let's try to dictate the physicality of this game. We try to dictate the script of this game by being the more physical team. Again, that's been a big question mark for Ohio State. But to me, this is an opportunity for them to get that Michigan curse, that hex, the cloud that's been over them in the rear view, get that taste out of their mouth, and start going back to what they were initially thought they could do, which was win a national championship.
So, Danny, if Ohio State plays to its level, Ohio State's winning this football game, right? Like, Ohio State's regular. So. Yeah, Ohio State's regular is still something that Tennessee can't necessarily jump up to. What is it going to take for Tennessee to jump up to Ohio State's level, in your opinion?
Oh, we're just talking about the physical matchups. Like, if Ohio State's offensive line struggles and Tennessee is able to get after Will Howard, where he can't get outside the pocket, he doesn't hurt you with his legs, and Nico takes a couple of those shots and connects on them, then you're in trouble. And if Dylan Sampson, if they do like Kalel Mullings did, and he runs it 35 times, and they control the time of possession, and it may be ugly, but maybe they hit a shot play, that is exactly what you want to see unfold. So I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic, but that's where I think you get nervous if you are having trouble and they're starting to sustain long, ugly drives, working the ball on the ground. That's when you're like, uh-oh, maybe this really is a problem, the fact that we are getting challenged physically and we're not up to it.
Bud, do you trust Ryan Day right now? Like, it's Friday afternoon. This game's going to be Saturday night. If you were invested in, I trust Ryan Day to win this coaching matchup, do you trust him?
I think so. Yeah, I look at the overall track record, and I mean, my confidence is shaken a little bit because up until that Michigan loss, really the only teams Ryan Day was losing to as Ohio State's head coach were teams that were serious contenders, for the national championship. Like they lost to that Georgia team that then turned around and buzzsawed TCU the next week, right? They lost to the Michigan team that TCU beat. Like there was very few like actual losses. We're like, wow, that's a bad loss, like to a team that's not very good. But this Michigan team, was different. Now, granted, they had some circumstances, but it's still at home, and like that felt like a game that he flubbed. And I really can't say that necessarily about the prior one. So I'm confident to shake a little bit, but I do still. It's still Chip Kelly and Jim Knowles. I think they will probably find a way. But I don't know that Tennessee's a great opponent for them to play, because Tennessee actually is pretty physical. Like they're spread, but Tennessee will hit you. And like they use more tight ends and more insert stuff this year than they have in prior years. The defensive line is pretty strong and pretty deep. If Nico comes to play at like his maybe 85th percentile of what he is capable of physically, then I think the Buckeyes are actually in trouble. But Nico has not done that often this year against decent to good opponents.
Tom, what you think?
I think if you look at like with the Ryan Day situation, as long as Tennessee doesn't show up wearing maize and blue, I do trust him for the most part, because like as Bud was touching on, he has been an excellent coach for the Buckeyes. He's had a Michigan problem. That's it. No matter their rank, no matter how good they are, sitting there and staring at the Wolverines has been his biggest problem. I look at this Tennessee team as a very good team, but I have seen Ohio State beat plenty of very good teams under Ryan Day. And I think talent-wise, as far as the complete roster is concerned, the Buckeyes are the better team. I think they have an excellent offensive coordinator. I think they have an excellent defensive coordinator. And I think at home in this environment, you look at this as a situation that Ohio State shouldn't blow it. That said, there is kind of that dark cloud hovering over things where they did just lose their last game. And Ryan Day we've seen, he gets, he lets things impact him. And if he's spent the last few weeks just kind of rolling over in bed at night with a bunch of sleepless nights, having nightmares about the Michigan loss, does that impact him in this game? I don't think it does. I think Ohio State's the better team and they're more likely to win. And as Bud and Danny have touched on, if Nico has a great game and defensively they're flying all over the ball, making plays, well, then you tip your cap, you lost the game. But I just think as long as Ohio State shows up and doesn't beat itself, it wins this game.
Ooh, Saturday night, we will see there between Ohio State and Tennessee. The winner advances to the Rose Bowl to take on the 1 seed, the Oregon Ducks. Well, coming up on the other side, we will get into the 5-12 matchup in the bracket, where the 12 seed ain't exactly the Cinderella that we would expect, but how do they stack up against the SEC runner-up? Texas, Clemson, taking you inside the matchup. Next.
Boy, I need.
Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Our midday game on Saturday features the SEC runner-up, the Texas Longhorns, going up against the ACC champions, the Clemson Tigers. Now, the Tigers needed Miami to blow a 21-0 lead to even make it into the ACC title game, and then a 56-yard walk-off field goal to win the ACC title game and arrive here. And they face a Texas team that is very frustrated. Now, watching the way that things went in an overtime defeat to the Georgia Bulldogs. So, Tom, when we look at the Texas side of things, how are you looking at Texas to try to attack Clemson in this matchup?
I mean, I think if you see what Clemson has done this season, they've been very up and down, particularly on offense. Like when they've played better defenses, they have struggled. When they've played bad defenses, they've stunted all over them and scored a whole bunch of points. But either way, they're typically relying on Cade Klubnik to do most of the damage for them. As a runner, he's really kind of taken a step forward and done a lot of damage. So if I'm Texas defensively, if I want to stop this Clemson offense, I'm just trying to stop Cade Klubnik. I'm going to try to keep him in the pocket. And when he gets out of the pocket, I'm dedicating my guys to chasing him down and making the tackle before he get an explosive play or extend the drives. And I'm saying, all right, Cade, stay in the pocket and beat me with your arm, with your receivers, because go ahead, try to name a Clemson receiver. You can't. Nobody can. Nobody's seen them all year. So when I look at that situation defensively, that's my game plan. On offense, I'm just trying not to make too many mistakes. I think defensively, the Tigers are solid. They're not elite. I think that, you look at their defensive line, it is still good, but it is not the kind of defensive line we have seen Clemson have in years past. So even with my running game struggling all year due to injuries, I'm trying to establish the run. I'm trying to lighten the load on Quinn Ewers as much as I possibly can, because as we've talked about at length, Quinn is not at 100%. And I don't think you want to put too much on his plate. I think you want to make things easier on him, maybe a little play action, some short throws, and then scheme up some big plays, hopefully, that you can hit. But I think overall, if I'm Texas, I look at this game, Clemson, they've got that team of destiny vibe going, Chip. You mentioned the things that they needed to happen to get here, and they got them. But I just don't think they quite measure up overall to this Texas roster. So it's a very simple game plan for me. Force them to do what they're not comfortable doing. And then myself, I'm just going to do what I'm good at and try to limit my mistakes, and I should win this game.
Am I crazy to think that Cade Klubnik is one of the top 3 quarterbacks in this postseason tournament?
Yes. Yes, you're insane.
But all right, this is all right, yeah, exactly. So let's slow down and hear me out, because I think there is a clear-cut number one. It's Dylan Gabriel, right? Of quarterbacks that you trust the most. Mm-hmm. And then it's kind of a bunch of dudes. And if you look at Cade Klubnik, who does have 33 touchdowns and only 5 interceptions through the air, 33 passing touchdowns, I think he has been one of the more trustworthy playmaking quarterbacks. Now, you could say, who's he done it against? It hasn't been great. But even against South Carolina, a defense that gave a lot of SEC quarterbacks trouble, he still threw pretty well against them and had 2 rushing touchdowns, and his only interception was on that batted ball in the last play of the game, which was really bad. And I would say the emergence of Wesco and TJ Moore, a couple of freshman wide receivers, is one reason to maybe say maybe Clemson is getting right at the right time. So I think Cade Klubnik is one of the better quarterbacks out there, which makes this dangerous. Now, if it was a healthy Quinn Ewers versus a healthy Cade Klubnik, I would say I'd give the edge to Quinn Ewers. But the version of Quinn Ewers we've seen lately has not been the same as we've seen him at his peak.
So let's talk quarterbacks, but on the other side. Which quarterbacks has Clemson seen recently? So Kevin Jennings tore him up pretty good for SMU. He's solid. South Carolina's quarterback, who's not a great thrower, had an okay day and went off with his legs pretty hard. Citadel, don't know the quarterback's name there. We'll pass that one. They got Pitt when Pitt was really dinged up, right? They got Virginia Tech when Kyron Drones was really dinged up. Tyler Shuck for Louisville tore him up. Then Virginia doesn't have a quarterback. Wake Forest this year, quarterback was kind of iffy. They got Florida State, which definitely didn't have a quarterback. Sorry, Danny, and myself. Sorry as well. And they got Stanford's backup. So really, since that last week of September, they have played 2 decent quarterbacks in Tyler Shuck and Kevin Jennings, and both those guys tore him up pretty good. So I am a little bit worried about Clemson's defense, but I'm mainly worried about Clemson tackling Texas. If Bond's not going to play in round 1, we know what this is going to be from Sark. They're going to try to get Wisner going in the run game like they did against Texas A&M, but a lot of it's going to be, can you get the Clemson secondary to miscommunicate stuff so you can create wide open looks? Will Clemson tackle the Texas skill players in space as well as Georgia did? Because Georgia has shut that stuff down now twice, because their DBs are way more physical than the short guys that Texas runs out their receiver when they try to block some of those screens on the outside. I think Georgia was really intentional about how they played that. I don't know if Clemson's DBs can be physical enough to do so. But if they can, the Clemson can win this ballgame. Texas doesn't have a lot of counters this year.
There have been 6 games that Cade Klubnik has played against SEC opponents. Does anyone know how many touchdown passes Cade Klubnik has in those 6 games against SEC opponents?
I'm sure it's been a whole lot, because he is the top 3 quarterback in the playoff. Yeah.
0. This is what I can't get by. I can't get by what happened on Labor Day weekend. And I know that Texas's defensive front has bodies on bodies on bodies. They've got guys on the interior that can push a center into your lap. They've got edge rushers who can come out and come screaming from behind you and maybe even knock the ball away. Like I think that we're going to know really early on whether Texas has a chance to hang inside this game. Whether Clemson has a chance to hang in this game. Heck, to even hang inside this number, which we have now seen start to drift all the way out to 12 and 12 and a half. if Clemson, which has had an offensive line that has dealt with a lot of injuries all throughout the season, if they've got a good plan to either get the blocks done or neutralize them with your game planning and your play calling, but from offensive coordinator Garrett Riley, well then, yes, I don't trust Quinn Ewers. I don't trust Texas's offense. If Texas plays down, that's when we start to get into Team of Destiny, Mr. Cade Klubnik 50-yard touchdown with a minute remaining to save Clemson's season type stuff. But that is something that I am very concerned about, because what Cade Klubnik does against Virginia and Stanford and Wake Forest and App State is not the same as what happens when he goes up against those athletically gifted and different defensive fronts. So it is Bud was talking about the Ohio State-Tennessee game. You'll be able to tell based on early downs the way a drive is going to go. But it kind of seems to me like we might be able to tell very early on what to expect from Clemson in this matchup.
All right, well, let's play a quick game, fast, and OSTV. What's the competent passing game that Texas has seen not named Georgia? Colorado State, Michigan, UTSA, UL Monroe, Mississippi State with the backup quarterback, I should add. Oklahoma with the backup. Georgia, so that we don't count that one. Vandy, Florida with the third stringer. Arkansas with Taylor Green, who was dinged up. Kentucky with the backup. Texas A&M, and that was Reed, not Wegman. And then Georgia again. Is it possible that Texas has only seen one decent to a good passing game, and that was Georgia? And remember, the second half of Georgia, Carson Beck got hurt and didn't play. I even if you don't love Cade, there's a really good chance that Clemson is by far the second best passing team that Texas has seen all season. And I think actually down the stretch, their passing game was better than Georgia's. So,
I'd agree.
I mean, there is some chance that Texas secondary, it could be ripe to get exposed here if Clemson can block it up. But I don't know they can't.
You know what concerns me? Clemson's rush defense, 14th in the ACC. They have not been great against some of the more physical teams. That's what concerns me. We were talking about Sark, wants to lean on him. Kelvin Banks, he's back, right? Like, they don't have Isaiah Bond. They don't have some of their weapons. Quinn's been banged up. This is a game where maybe we don't see Sark get in his bag and try to get, all these big plays down the field. Maybe they see them lean on Clemson's defense if Clemson can't get off the field against the run.
That's so huge here. They've got Clemson's got good pass rushers, but you are spot on with that run defense, and you've got to do a good job against the run on first and second down to be able to set up that scenario where TJ Parker can pin his ears back and try to get after the quarterback. Great call. Coming up on the other side, we will look at the first game of Saturday when it comes to the first round action. SMU traveling up to Happy Valley to take on Penn State. We'll take you inside the matchup and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network, continuing to take you inside the matchup of these massive college football playoff first-round games on campus. And those last two words, on campus, they feel incredibly significant when we look at this next one, which is SMU going to play Penn State. And Penn State home games have been one of college football's great special environments. This is a fan base that has been yearning to make it to the college football playoff. James Franklin, their head coach, among the winningest head coaches of the playoff era, who prior to this day has yet to be in a college football playoff game. So we're going to have cold temperatures for the ponies from Texas. But what about the football of it all? So, Bud, take me inside what you're looking for from Penn State in terms of what they need to do to hold serve against SMU.
Sure. So I think Penn State will probably continue to go at a pretty slow pace, although they did show a little more pace there against Oregon in that Big Ten championship game. Penn State is looking to pop explosive runs thanks to its motion and shifts they're going to do with Andy Kotelnicki's offense. And I think they have a pretty good chance to pop them, actually, because SMU is very aggressive on defense, both in terms of their blitz percentage, but also in terms, they're in scream out field. And I think there is some chance that Penn State is able to kind of wall them and get them pinned and just hit some creases here against this SMU defense. But Penn State is not a very good team when they're behind the chains because their drop back game is not particularly strong. So If SMU is successful in getting some of those early tackles for loss, then I think SMU has a real shot to win the game, but probably easier said than done. I don't know that I love the matchup here for SMU's defense against what Penn State wants to do offensively.
Yeah, I think what you're going to see from Penn State and Andy Kotelnicki is they're going to hit the Tyler Warren button, and they're going to hit it often. If you've watched SMU defensively this season, they have struggled to contain tight ends pretty much all season long. And Tyler Warren won the Mackey Award, but he's not really just a tight end. He's a center. He's a quarterback. He's a running back. He's a wide receiver. He does everything for this offense, and they keep giving him more and more because every time they put more on his plate, he handles it with aplomb and plays well. And I think that when you factor in also that Bo Pribula, their backup quarterback, has entered the transfer portal and is no longer on the team, and he was a part of their red zone package, particularly as an added rushing threat, we're going to see Tyler Warren take a lot of those snaps that they were giving Pribula, and they'll probably see him put him in similar situations. So I look at this matchup. I think he'll have a big game. And I also think that, Bud, you mentioned it, like they're going to be able to hit big plays. But I also think it's going to be somewhat of a like just chiseling away. Like if you look, they've got Nick Singleton, 225 pounds, Katron Allen, 220 pounds, Tyler Warren's 265. This SMU defense has been good up front, but once you get past that defensive line, it's not a lot of big bodies. And it's not a lot of guys who are going to have a lot of fun trying to tackle these huge dudes in the cold where it is never fun to tackle somebody. So I think as this game wears on, Penn State is just going to keep leaning on them and leaning on them. And then in the second half, you're going to start to see a lot of those explosives start hitting and Penn State possibly pull up here.
I don't even want to say this out loud because he'll run with this and he'll use this against me forever. But I talked to Yogi Roth in Indianapolis when we went on the field before the game, and Yogi Roth's been covering the Big Ten. And I was asking him about, the teams, and he's like, Oregon realized doesn't matter who you're playing, the pounding that you take in the Big Ten because of the bigger body style, because of that pounding, it starts to wear on you. And I totally agree with you, Tom, that is what concerns me the most. And if I just saw, and I get that SMU is one of the better rush defenses in the country, but I don't think they've been tested against a front like this, an offensive line, or a tight end that is a kind of a gadget player who can also run the ball out of the backfield, and a two-headed monster like Katron Allen and Nick Singleton back there, who both rushed for 100 yards plus against Oregon's defense, who is, I think, one of the better defensive fronts out there. And you went right through them. So that is my biggest fear for SMU, is that they are just going to be hanging on by a thread, and that those body blows, which Penn State will be delivering throughout the game, ultimately will be too much for them to handle. So I think that's the biggest matchup for me. I think SMU will figure out a way to put up points against Penn State's defense, and maybe I actually think Graham's game script, it could play out similar to the ACC championship game where you kind of get down, but I don't think they'll be able to stop Penn State throughout 4 quarters. Like, I just think Penn State will keep pulling away. SMU might put up some points when they finally figured out, and Kevin Jennings, you get some yards after the catch from some of the guys in space. I just worry that those body blows are going to be too much when it's all said and done.
Yeah, Danny, we can't count out SMU. I mean, there's a resilience that was shown there where the idea that this game is ever going to be over, it seems highly unlikely. Sorry, Bud, do you have something you wanted to add?
No, I do think, just like to throw back to this game that we had last year, Kansas versus Illinois. Same offensive coordinator for Kansas now, Andy Kotelnicki. Illinois, their D-line up the field very fast, very aggressive. They want to play a lot of man coverage. Kansas ate in that game, and that's kind of how I think this could play out if Drew Aller plays well enough, because obviously Daniels for Kansas that day played exceptionally well.
All right, well, we will get into the Friday night action up in snowy South Bend, Indiana, taking you inside the matchup of Indiana against Notre Dame and more next. Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, and the time has arrived. We have been following, we have been discussing, we have been highlighting the Indiana Hoosiers all season long as Curt Cignetti started exceeding expectations and eventually got this program to the college football playoff. But they've got a tough task ahead going up against a Notre Dame team that has won 10 games in a row. Danny, when we think about this matchup, what are you going to have your eyes on?
Indiana, how do they handle Riley Leonard? If they can keep Riley Leonard from killing him on the ground, I think they can win the game outright. I do not think Riley Leonard is a great passer. I don't think he can take this game over if they're able to do that, but that's a big if, right? Jeremiah Love, that and Riley Leonard with his legs, that combo has been outstanding. So that to me is what it comes down to. And I go back to Indiana's defense against Ohio State. They looked pretty good against Michigan. Again, that's more of a one-dimensional offense similar to this one. They did pretty good, held them in check, but I think that's the outcome that determines the game. And then I'm curious to see if the offense can play better than they did against Ohio State when they were totally stymied. One adjustment, Kirk Cinetti said he's still livid that he went silent snap count in Columbus. He said he had never done it in his career. He said he'd learned from it. He's mad at himself for doing it. Going to go back to a traditional cadence where they actually communicate and say, we'll just deal with it. I think his tackles were in a really tough spot, trying to listen, trying to look down the line to see when they're coming off, that it hurt them. That's one small adjustment that I think could help Indiana offensively.
You know, I have the windows open here. It is snowing outside. I've got the heat turned down because I want to feel the elements that the players on the field will be feeling when this game plays tonight. And there is snow in the forecast, and I've seen a lot in these kind of games. Turnovers play a big factor in snow games. Turnovers have also played a huge factor in the seasons for both of these teams. In turnover margin nationally, they rank second and fourth nationally. But what's more important to me is points off turnover margin. Like, you get the turnovers, but what do you do with them once you have them? These are the top two teams in the country in points off of turnover margin per game. Notre Dame is averaging plus 7.75 points per game. Indiana's right behind them at plus 7.25. I think that is going to be a huge factor tonight. I think if it's a clean game and there are no turnovers, Notre Dame will win because it's the more talented team and it's better on both sides of the ball. But I think Indiana, to have a chance to go into Notre Dame Stadium tonight and knock off the Fighting Irish and shock the world once again, they need to force mistakes out of Riley Leonard. When he's running in that cold, slippery ball, hit him, knock the ball loose, and get on top of it. I think that will be the deciding factor. If Indiana forces turnovers, they've got a shot. If they don't, no way.
I think for Notre Dame, the path is pretty clear here. And the path is probably right up the middle, right at Indiana's defense. Indiana's defense is not the biggest defense in the world. It's going to be very active, a lot of movement, see if they can confuse the Irish. At home, that probably shouldn't work if Notre Dame handles its business. But knowing that, Indiana, I think, has to load up against the run here really, really hard and see if the Irish will pivot quickly enough to throwing on early downs. We do know that Notre Dame's weakness so far this year is when they're behind the chains, and everybody's bad when they're behind the chains, but Notre Dame is meaningfully bad when they're behind the chains because Leonard, as Danny mentioned, is not a great passer. So if they can get them into third and longs, I think Indiana actually has a real shot to win this game. But if Notre Dame can run the ball, then it's basically night-night.
Great quote from Curt Cignetti as he was asked about the environment. He said, have you seen our quarterback? He's from Canada. They'll be fine in the snow. He is ready to go. That, of course, being the big maple, Mr. Curtis Rourke. You can watch that game on
Better
Friday night.
Klubnik.
Yeah. And look what
I
you
actually
can do.
had him second. I did have him.
You can hang out with us after the game tonight, on Friday night, and on Saturday. We will be live at youtube.com/cover3 at the conclusion of both the Indiana Notre Dame and also Ohio State Tennessee with our instant reaction, our look aheads to the quarterfinal matchups that we will now know the participants of. It is all part of what you can get for our college football playoff coverage here at the Cover 3 podcast. So you can scan that QR code. You can download us wherever you get your podcast and keep it locked here with the Cover 3 podcast.